Hello, we continue celebrating the Logic Day, and I would like to invite our first speaker. The first talking of our third session will be presented by Professor Stephen Priest, the University of Oxford, and the title of his speech is Cosmic Questions, Spiritual Answers.
Are we ready? Are we ready to go? Shall I start? Okay, thanks. Well, what I want to suggest is that the most profound questions of philosophy have theological answers or spiritual answers. Now, in order to understand this claim, I better say something about what philosophy is. Philosophy, I define as the attempt to answer philosophical questions. This definition doesn't get us very far until we know what makes a question a philosophical question. A philosophical question is a question we have no method for answering. I don't define a philosophical question as a question we don't have an answer for, but that's no doubt in a sense true of them, although in principle some of us might know the answers to some philosophical questions. What defines a question as philosophical is that we have no method for addressing that question. Therefore, philosophy as an academic subject is about developing problem-solving techniques or finding out techniques for solving problems or answering questions. Now, I think that's all that philosophical questions have in common. Philosophical questions don't have any common subject matter. For example, some philosophical questions are about numbers. Do numbers exist? What is a number? If numbers exist, where are they? If they are not anywhere, does it make sense to say that they exist? Some philosophical questions are about consciousness. What's the relationship between consciousness and the brain? What is consciousness? Am I my consciousness? And so on. Some philosophical questions are about politics. Should we obey the state? Under which conditions should we or should we not obey the state? What is the state? And so on. So what I'm saying is that it's not subject matter that defines something as philosophy, and philosophy is quite unusual as an academic subject in this respect. For example, history is defined by its subject matter, the study of the past, or perhaps the human past, the study of the difference that the existence of humanity has made to anything so far. Mathematics is the study of reality through number, or perhaps essentially the study of numbers, and so on. Sociology is the study of society. All right, so what I'm saying is that philosophy is the study of a kind of residue, a huge residue of questions which we have no method for addressing. Now, what I want to say is that some of the, or conceivably all of the most profound philosophical questions have theological answers or spiritual answers. I don't have any prior religious motivation in coming to this conclusion. I was brought up an atheist, and my father was a Marxist atheist. I was formally baptized into the Church of England when I was extremely young, when I was a baby, but I haven't particularly taken religion seriously. I've been interested in meditation and religious experience and mystical experience, that sort of thing, probably because I was brought up in the 60s and 1970s in the West. Now, I'll give you some examples of profound philosophical questions which will turn out to have spiritual answers. In this limited time, I'll just mention three, possibly a few more than that. Now, the first question is, what is it to be? What does it mean for anything at all to exist? Or what is the difference between being and not being? Now, many philosophical questions are confused with other questions that are not particularly philosophical, and with other questions which are philosophical. Now this question, what is it to be, or what is it to exist rather than not exist, is often mixed up with the question, what is there? And that question's partly scientific, partly sociological, partly philosophical. Construed as a philosophical question, what is there, is answered by lists which philosophers and other people argue about. For example, what is there? The answer to that question might be the number 3, the Archangel Gabriel, physical objects, corners, acts of political aggression, agreements between human beings, thought processes, atoms, molecules. You can imagine a list of things that allegedly exist, and people argue or squabble about whose list is right or whose list could possibly be complete. Now, the question, what is it to be, or what does it mean to exist, can partly be understood as the question of what the difference is between someone's list being right and someone's list being wrong. Supposing somebody's list is right and the things on that person's list exist, what is thereby true of them? What is true of anything if it is rather than is not? Now, it's surprisingly difficult to say what it means to say that something exists. I mean, existing is not the same as being perceived, for example, because if numbers exist, numbers are not perceived, but they exist. If God exists, God is not perceived, but God exists. If whatever caused the Big Bang exists, then it's not perceptible from within this universe anyway, and yet it exists. So what being rather than not being is terribly hard to understand. Now, there are various strategies for answering this question, but the only really promising strategy is to sever the idea of being from the idea of being something. Being is not the same as being F, or being is not the same thing as having some feature or other. Indeed, being is not the same thing as this thing rather than that thing existing. In principle, there is, or there could be, just being as opposed to nothing. Now, I regard this as an insight that there could be being, so to speak, monolithically, or in the absence of particular things, or being full stop is not the same thing as this particular thing or that particular thing existing. Now, in this monolithic sense, I think it's a necessary truth that there could not have been nothing. In other words, there is necessarily being rather than nothing. Now, what's the reason for that? The reason for that, or the argument for that, is that there is necessarily no nothing, or that necessarily it's not the case that there is nothing. Now, what's the reason for that, or what's the argument for that? Well, supposing somebody says there is nothing, or there exists nothing, or some claim like that, then that claim is contradictory. That claim is contradictory. There exists nothing attributes existence to nothing, or there is nothing attributes being to nothing. This idea is in Western philosophy intermittently. In fact, this idea is first stated by one of, or arguably the earliest Western philosopher, Parmenides. Parmenides, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, who says that necessarily there's no nothing. Now, if there's necessarily no nothing, there's necessarily being rather than nothing. Now, once we establish that there is being rather than nothing, that there is being rather than nothing follows not just from the existence of being, but from the necessity of being, and not just from the existence of beings, but from the necessity of pure being. Once we've established that, we can start to look at the properties of pure being. Now, if we look at being in this monolithic sense as opposed to beings, we notice that being, being qua being is infinite or unbounded, even if beings are finite and bounded. Even if beings are material, pure being is immaterial. Even if beings are a plurality, or one being can be singled out as distinct from another being as being, or being in this pure or monolithic sense, is not one being amongst others. In short, being is not a being. Now, the more one identifies, if you like, phenomenologically, in a profound or fundamental phenomenological sense, these properties of pure being, the more they look like some of the properties of God. They look like some of the properties of God. For example, not being physical, being the ground of beings. Without being, there are no beings, but not vice versa. If you like, God creates freely, or it's a contingent fact that there are beings, but it's a necessary truth that there is being rather than not being. Being, like God, is one, but not in some sense that could in principle admit of two. Being is necessarily or essentially one, or essentially monolithic. Now, there's an awful lot more that could be said about that, but actually, I better move on because we'll be short of time. Now, I'll talk about a different question, a different philosophical question. I'll say something about the philosophical question, why are you you? Or what is it that makes you you? Now, one of the difficulties with doing philosophy is that we think we already understand the questions, but very often we don't already understand the questions. In order to understand philosophical questions, it's very often necessary to think kinds of thought we haven't thought before. Now, what I mean by this question is that once all the empirical facts are in about you, I mean, supposing by some criterion there's a totality of facts about you, you're a certain height, a certain weight, you were born in a certain place, in a certain country, you've had this upbringing, you were born of these parents, you think these thoughts, you have these emotional states, you have this neurology, and so on. There's a totality of psychophysical facts about the human being you take yourself to be. There's no logical inference from this totality of facts to a particular human being being you, or a human being being you, if that is the relationship between you and a human being, is an extra fact over and above this totality of facts. Now, the fact that you are a human being, or at least that you exist and are closely associated with a human being, shows up in the fact that you view the world from just one human being. There's just one human being, such that you never perceive its face, or you never visually perceive its face. You've never seen the back of your own head. You go, by and large, where this human being goes. You can't step out, and in the normal course of things, you can't step out of this human being and walk around it, tour it. You are centered on this human being. Now, indeed, I take the view that the human being that you normally take yourself to be could have existed exactly in the manner that it exists now without its being you, without its being you. You might not have existed, and the human being that you normally take yourself to be could have been somebody else. It's an interesting question whether they could have been nobody at all. I think possibly not. But the human being that you associate yourself with could have existed in the manner of another member of the public. Now, it follows from this sort of understanding that nothing mental and nothing physical is sufficient for making some existence your existence. Once all these psychophysical facts are in, the fact of the human being being you is an extra fact. the human being you, so to speak, switches the lights on, or the whole of existence from your point of view is switched on or illuminated by the consciousness that is yours. Now, the thing is, in science, including psychology, and in secular philosophy, we have no idea why something is you, or we have no idea how to address this question, what is it for something to be you? But of course, in theology, we have the notion of the soul, the idea of something being irreducibly and primitively you, and something not being identical with, on the one hand, your mind as a totality of thought and experiential processes, and not, on the other hand, identical with your body as a totality of physical processes. You are not, so to speak, this psychophysical constellation. You are the subject of your experiences. You are not your experiences. You are that which has them. You are not that body. You're that which lives through your body, or that which operates your body. You are what we could call a real presence. And this is explicable only if we take the view that you are a soul. You are this specific interiority. You are this absolute interiority. Now, I've mentioned these two questions: what is it to be, and what is it to be you, or how come something is you? And the first is only explicable if we take, or the first question is only answerable if we take the view that being is the being of God, or being in the pure sense, or in the fundamental sense, is the being of God. And the second question is only answerable if we take the view that your own existence is the existence of this soul, of this absolute interiority or inner space. Now, I think I've used up 18 minutes, so I'll just say something about a third question. There's a cluster of questions about now. The questions about now include: why is it now? Why is it now? When is it now? How long has it been now for? Is it ever now? What is it that makes a time the present time? Is there a difference between the past and the future? If so, how come there's a difference between the past and the future? Now, there are different ways of coming at these questions about now. One way to come at them is to say that now is an indexical expression, that now refers to when the person is who says now is speaking, whatever time it is then. That's not wrong. Now is an indexical expression, but that rather empirical and shallow understanding of now doesn't take us to the profundity of the problem, of the existential reality of the time being now. To understand now in this more profound sense, we have to understand now as between the future and the past. If we hang on to the idea of now as when I am, phenomenologically speaking, you personally demarcate the future from the past. You personally demarcate everything that is to come from everything that has happened. And it's far from clear why you should be invested with this enormous cosmic significance. It's not clear why you are the demarcation line between what has happened and what has not happened yet. And in order for you to have this demarcation function, something more than an explanation from within the universe is necessary. Something of inordinate power from outside the universe is necessary for you to mark the difference between the future and the past. Another way of coming at this question is to note that the future and the past do not exist. The future will exist, but it does not exist. And the past did exist, but it does not but it does not exist. Therefore, neither the future nor the past exist. So if there is any time at all, it is the present time. Or put it another way, whenever it's the case that something happens, now is the time when it does happen, as opposed to the times when it will happen and the times when it did happen. To say that a time is a time when something happens is to say that that time is the present time, or to say that it's now. In that sense, we can say that it's always now, it's never not now, or the now is the timeless now. One might, of course, disagree with that and say, oh, no, this is not right at all, because the now is so Heraclitean, so flux-like that there's no such time as now. And what we have to do justice to that thought, that the thought that the future is becoming past, and the becoming past of the future just is the transition, which we call now. But we need to draw a distinction phenomenologically between what happens and when what happens happens. And phenomenologically speaking, the flux or the transition all pertains to what happens in the now, and the now within which the flux comes and goes is utterly timeless or utterly unchanging. Now, if we inspect the properties of the timeless now, the now within which everything that we're ever acquainted with happens, these turn out to be some of the properties of the presence of God, or these turn out to be identical with some of the properties that religious people would ascribe to God. For example, being necessary for any happening. Unless the time is timelessly now, nothing happens. Nothing could ever happen. Also, as well as grounding what we could call creation or the universe or all happenings, the timeless now is clearly immaterial, because being material pertains to processes which come and go within the now, physical processes. In any straightforward sense, the now is not mental. It's not made up of streams of consciousness or experiences which come and go in some worldly sense. Rather, it makes all that possible. So the now is the timeless presence of God, or has attributes which a religious person would ascribe to God. Andrew, you're going to cut me off at some point because we need time for discussion. Do you want discussion after the half an hour, or do you want discussion? Before the end of the half an hour? Andrew, Chairman?
Yeah. So we can start now the discussion.
Yeah.
And maybe some questions. Maybe my question is the first. So I would like to ask you a quite philosophical question. From what or from whom these philosophical questions came and come? So,
okay.
So I explain maybe a context. In India, there is an own tradition of logic, and there are two important branches of this tradition: the Nyaya logic and the Yogacara logic. It is very interesting that they are very similar and very close to each other, but they are similar logically from the point of view of pure logic. So, for example, they follow at the same time their logical determinism, but philosophically they are so different. In the Yogacara philosophy, they are strongly atheistic, but in the Nyaya philosophy they are strongly theistic. So from what or from whom these questions came and come?
Yeah, I think that philosophical questions are caused or generated by pushing day-to-day conditioned thinking further than is useful for practical purposes. someone might ask, oh, what were we doing before we were talking about this philosophy here? Well, we were walking along the street, and before, what did you do before that? Oh, we had lunch. What were we doing before that? Oh, well, we were asleep in our homes, and so on. Well, if you carry on with the questioning, you arrive at the question, was there a first event, or was there a first thing that that happened? And lots of philosophical questions are like that, extrapolations from ordinary ways of thinking taken beyond any practicality or use. This is one of the reasons why philosophy is regarded as useless. Well, I mean, I began by saying that philosophical questions are questions we have no method for answering. They're so disparate that I imagine that anyone who reflects on what they're doing in other subjects is likely to come up with a philosophical question. I mean, if somebody is doing some maths, but then does wonder, well, what are numbers? Are numbers only in your mind, or am I discovering mathematics, or am I inventing it when I prove it? Somebody who reflects on the subject. I mean, in logic, you could imagine somebody thinking, oh yes, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Yeah, I've learned that. But you can imagine some of them wonder, well, actually, why? You know, why? You know.
Okay, thank you. And our second question from Daniel. Yeah.
I can't hear the chap, actually. I can't hear the chap. Andrew or Ricardo, can you do something about the technology? I can't hear Danielle von Wachter.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear Danielle von Wachter? I can't hear him.
Now? Can you hear me?
No, it's fine.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Thank you.
Good, great, thank you. Now, my objection is that I think the three questions that you mention are no real questions. They have no answer. I think that not only do we not have a method, I think they have no answer. So I think they're pseudo questions. They don't give us, say, possible alternatives, one of which only is true. They don't really divide the possible scenarios into two, which I think is a condition for a real question. And I think real philosophical questions are ones like, is there a God? Are there souls and other true objective moral facts and so on? So why should I think that these are questions? Why? I think just that, I'm not a friend of Kahner, but in this case, I would say, yes, these are not real questions.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I suppose my whole education, you know, in philosophy has been through Hume and Kant and the logical positivists. I mean, I think that the whole drift of philosophy, especially since Kant, has been to try to show that metaphysical questions are not real. But I don't accept any of these neo-Kantian strains in philosophy. I think the questions are real because unless there is being rather than nothing, unless there's being rather than nothing, there are no things, there are no people, there are no thoughts, there are no emotions, there's no particular thing. There are all these particular things, therefore there is being rather than nothing. Now I see no good philosophical ground for saying that the question, what is being, has no answer. I'd say we don't know a priori that the question has no answer. I mean, it might be that you're right about that. It might be that there is no answer to be had, but it might not be like that. It might just be that we don't know. It might be that we just don't know the answer, or we haven't found the answer, or we haven't found the method for answering the question. So I wouldn't rule out a priori that there is no answer. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a pseudo question for that reason. I'd say that, you know, I'm not very sympathetic to the sort of either the later Wittgenstein or the logical positivist lines of thinking. I mean, I can see why there might be thought to be no answer to what is being, because being is not in any straightforward sense being something, or being is not being F, or being is not being mathematical, or being blue, or being red, or political, or something like that. And you might say, well, any genuine what is question is going to be answered by some sort of use of predicates like that. You know, if you ask what is a war, or what is the capital of England, or something like that, you're going to start naming things and producing strings of predicates. So it might be like that. It might be that there's no answer, but I don't think our epistemological situation is one where we know that there's no answer. And even if there's no answer, I'm not inclined to say the question wasn't genuine. I mean, I think actually at a metaphysical level, we know quite a lot about being. I think if you read Parmenides' poem, which is written at the level of being, not beings, he manages to say quite a lot about pure being. So I'm inclined to think that the question does have an answer after all, actually, for that reason. But I mean, I'm not wholly unsympathetic to what you're saying. I think we are reaching the point in philosophy where, so to speak, normally we'd say these are brute facts, or the concepts that I'm trying to analyze are primitive, or we've reached the end of the corridor and we can't go through the door, or it's kind of madness to try to go through the door. But I want to go through the door. I think some people have been through the door, some mystics. I mean, it's incredible to my mind that the author of the Tractatus wrote philosophical investigations later.
Professor Priest, sorry, we have a very short question.
Yeah,
and to continue our session.
In Daniel's point.
Mm-hmm. And now the question from Martin.
Thank you. I like your definition referring to the method very much, but is it right? I mean, when we have some philosophical school like analytical philosophy, does it mean that then when they have methods, it's not philosophy anymore? And still someone may claim that, philosophy has a, let's say, negative object. I mean, it is asking where nobody asked before. And then even if the questions are asked, so like about God, it's still a bit negative object because it's still philosophy when the answers are not definite and they are not set up by particular sciences. So what about this?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Those are very interesting points. I suppose on the first point, where we start to have a method for answering philosophical questions, and if we're successful in that, I think that the questions are being addressed and they are no longer philosophical. They're no longer philosophical because somebody has invented a method. I mean, it seems to me that in the late 17th century and early 18th century, Locke and Leibniz treat the debate over innate knowledge, innate ideas as philosophical. But later, in the 19th century, with the discovery of the gene and the invention of genetics, methods are found for addressing these questions empirically. And so the question is no longer philosophical. So we could ask, but by my definition, a problem is philosophical, but we can always ask philosophical for whom? Philosophical for whom, right? Okay. Being philosophical is a relationship between the question and some people, some inquirers. On your second point about philosophy being negative, well, it's a bit like, it's a bit as Daniel was just saying, I mean, there is, I would call a lot of this anti-philosophy, dissolving philosophical, a cloud of philosophy in a drop of grammar, this sort of thing, or all the problems can be solved by science or something. I think all that actually is pseudo philosophy. It says it's pseudoscience and pseudo philosophy.
Professor Priest, unfortunately, we have no time to continue our discussion. Thank you so much for your very interesting lecture, and we continue. So,
okay, thank you very much. Thanks for sharing it.